last edition of the Deeptech Mash was so natural and wonderful, they decided to move us into a studio and make it even more awkward than it was before.
Yes, I didn't watch the last episode, so that's the only reason I'm here.
To find out what happens next.
Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough. So there's got a few topics that we should talk about, though. So we've got some exciting things going on. One of which is a deep tech company raising $175 million, Quantexa.
Yep.
We're quite proud of that at Albion.
I hate this. What am I going to say about that? Yeah, lots of money.
Well, I mean, that's an exciting one because that's a great example of kind of UK deep tech AI coming together to become a global category leader.
Yeah. We also like Ed.
So who made the investment for our team. Yeah. Ed take a lot of credit. I mean, he made the investment before the product. That was back in the day when that was right at the early stages, which is what we like. Finding these deep tech companies very early and growing them to scale.
I also think it's encouraging to see a UK focused and based company kind of growing to that scale in a globally competitive market. We've heard a lot of, I guess, negative news in the past, few months, year about everyone running away. So it's nice to see Quantexa double down.
Yeah, all very good. And we have, in the meantime, we've been doing some of our own digging together with Bowhurst to look at the deep tech ecosystem and investment landscape. Some quite interesting stats that came out of that. I don't know what was your most exciting stat? Which thing did really stood out to you, Seb?
I think the most interesting stat was that if you look at when I joined Albion, the funding, the average ticket size has just gone up year on year on average since then, at UK wide, and I think that's pretty causal.
Interesting. Yeah. We often talk about mistaking correlation for causality in our investment discussions, and I think that's another classic example of that. But it is true that that was actually the most interesting thing that came out of all of the stats that we got from Bowhurst, and there was lots of interesting stuff. But deep tech investment has gone up a lot, and I think it's well known that now there is a much healthier deep tech investment environment in the UK, and at the same time, future of compute. It's kind of a subset of that. We'll talk about what that means, I guess, a bit later on, also going up. But what was most interesting to me was the size of the deals changing. So the proportion of the deals that were getting done, 5-10 years ago, there were so few deals in deep tech and particularly in future compute that were getting done at check sizes of more than sort of 3 or 4 million.
Yeah, I think I read about that in my history.
Thank you for pointing out that I'm old. But yeah, so now it looks like we have, I think it was 38% of all future of compute deals done in the UK last year or in the last 2 years were over £10 million, which is a complete sea change from history. I
mean, I think the biggest takeaway for me for that is just I think it speaks to both the appetite of founders and investors in the UK and in terms of really backing incredible companies. I think, there's always been this kind of conversation around the difference in check sizes valuations between the US, Europe and the UK. And I think we're moving in the right direction in terms of really backing and putting our money where our mouth is behind amazing companies doing transformative things, where we arguably have one of the biggest edges.
Yeah. For a long time, the risk appetite in the UK has not been there for these kind of really exciting big builds, particularly in the kind of hardware and deeper tech space. But we are slowly building a much more diverse investor base that some of it has the risk appetite to take on those challenges.
Do you think there's been a realization in the ecosystem around, I guess, time to market and the kind of value prop value you can drive in these companies?
If I'm honest, I think it's as much to do with software becoming so competitive that it's harder to create good returns there, that they're actually everyone is looking wider. And so you got that dynamic, software becoming harder. You've also got hardware becoming more interesting. So you've got the failure of Moore's law and all that kind of stuff, which means that people are more willing to put their money into innovations that are actually now needed to scale compute globally. For me, it's quite a personal thing because I made my first semiconductor investment in the UK at the end of 2016. And if you look at the Bowhurst data, I I think the year before, the entire future of compute investment in the UK was £3 million into every single future of compute company in the UK.
How much did you account for that?
Well, fortunately, none of that, because I only started in 2016. Was obviously that then catalysed everyone to get a lot more excited. But it did take a while. And I remember, so this is a next-gen memory company, which is actually going really, really well within our portfolio, and it's currently doing some really exciting things with some of the hyperscalers, some of the fabs that have just brought in a US CEO who's a memory expert and has sold companies for many hundreds of millions before in the space. But back in 2016, when we got going, it was just so hard to find any other VC, any other investor in the UK who wanted to do semiconductors. In fact, the anecdote that I tell about that is, I was emailing around going like, look, would anyone like to build a syndicate here? We're thinking you've got really interesting technology. It's transformative. And I emailed a fund which had a heritage of doing semiconductor investments and, in my view, was the most likely VC in the space to sort of take this opportunity seriously and want to invest. And I got a 3-word email reply from one of their investors, which just said no to semiconductors, which was a bit dispiriting at the time.
Be honest, when you did that in 2016, did you see the end of Moore's Law coming? Did you see the AI paradigm shift, or was it fortuitous in some ways?
So I think half of that I saw. I mean, Moore's Law was definitely as on the cards it was going to fail. I think even if you went back and read my very first investment paper written on that technology, it would reference Moore's Law struggling. What I didn't have the foresight to see was just how much software and AI in particular, would drive the demands way beyond. I mean, Moore's Law was failing and starting to mean that software was going to struggle. But now with AI, it's kind of that's added an order of magnitude to the level of failure of Moore's Law to keep up with what compute needs. So I think half right, half of it I saw, but not the AI paradigm shift.
Yeah. And how do you think about we talk about the future of community. I think we spoke about it in the first podcast, but as I said, I don't watch it to save myself my own embarrassment. So
very wise.
But how do you think about future of compute in terms, from a definition perspective, and also, memory versus processor, and everything in between?
So I think it's everything that takes us to a new paradigm of computing. We've had to sort of think a little bit about this as we put this report together with Bohus, because we wanted to sort of lift out the future compute companies from the Deeptech environment, looking at just to see what the trends were there. So for me, it's anything which takes compute towards fulfilling the new paradigm of AI or software, the software requirements. So the future compute is not squeezing more transistors onto the same chip. It's not laying another layer of flash on top of many layers of flash and trying to squeeze it in. It's how do you compute in different paradigms? Von Neumann architecture is that the way forward? Or we've got new architectures? Are we doing in-memory compute, analog compute, and then even into quantum? And so we've included quantum in our future of compute definition. So I think everything there, and then the delivery of that as well. So how do you move the vast quantities of data around? How do you make sure computation is happening efficiently? So that's kind of the areas of future of compute. I don't know.
Well, I'm glad we're sort of aligned. This report would have been difficult if we had completely different definitions. I think of it very high level as how do I enable an AI paradigm shift? I think I like to think of, in general, investments as first, second, third order consequences of big shifts in the world, and I think AI, being an AI first world, is probably increasingly likely. There's always a talk about it being a bubble, and maybe some companies are a bit of a bubble, but I think the transformative effects of AI are, in my mind, not slowing. I think they're only speeding up. So like you said, from everything from novel memory to novel processors to engineering approaches to increase throughput and scale and to manufacture. I think there was a touch on geopolitical issues as well, to the kind of networking that allows you to run these models and train these models across huge spaces or smaller spaces with less energy and more quickly. I think, one of the fundamental differences between AI and and kind of, I guess, traditional SaaS is, when you scale out with traditional SaaS, it was always this, you get much better margins as you scale, right? The cost starts to shrink in comparison to what you're returning. But there's an inference cost, obviously, to servicing in the kind of AI first world. And so that arguably means that the value of more efficient, cheaper, faster, better hardware is almost more acute. And I think that's a really interesting perspective to take.
And I think actually plays well into kind of a VC like Albion, where we're UK focused, because one of the difficulties with building scaled software businesses from the UK is that often the US is going to be the biggest market ultimately, and you're competing against startups that are starting in the US and capitalize there. It's always been a struggle, and unicorns and growth like Quantex are achieved in spite of, in some ways, in spite of being like founded in the UK first. Whereas Deeptech itself is generally sort of global by nature. I.e., if you've got a new semiconductor or you've got a new processor, you're going to be installing that. You're going to be building that probably in Taiwan. Your customers are going to be global. It's going to be in data centers globally. It's less like the obvious first market is always going to be the US.
Yeah.
And so that speaks to the UK strength and why all our university research, all our sort of deep tech foundation actually can be exploited more efficiently and better into a kind of global market that deep tech occupies, rather than the software paradigm that we've generally sort of made most returns from in the last 10 years.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think, and you see it in the kind of good founders in the UK still need to, as a result, in deep tech, be on the plane quite a lot and having those conversations. I think it's still the case that the early adopters of these technologies are often still in the US, that will be willing to take a punt, like first attempt on it. But I think deep tech, you can demonstrate more of a technical edge beforehand rather than this is a pro and a con. Software is in some ways easier because you can get into quick feedback loops, iterative feedback loops. But that requires having these early customers. That tends to be the case that culturally American enterprise takes punts on younger startups and technologies earlier. So, there's always this kind of trade-off. But I think, as you say, having the kind of technical edge that's driven by really fundamental research, really incredibly talented engineers, which we do have in the UK and Europe, means that, and with this increasing appetite to really back them to the point where they can show something definitively, gives them an advantage to then go and really scale aggressively head to head with their kind of American compatriots.
And you're seeing these kind of ecosystems of deep tech built up around the UK, around our kind of research institutions. One of the things that was interesting to me in the report or the data that we've got from Bohurst is nearly half of all deep tech companies are actually based in London, which wouldn't have intuitively thought of. But then when you go back to the basics and say, is it being built on research and innovation? Actually, half of the top 10 global universities in the UK are based in London. So not a surprise that actually we're seeing an awful lot of those kind of really kind of fundamental research-based companies springing up in our capital.
Yeah. I think it's less of a surprise for me just because I've only really ever been to Cambridge, Oxford, and and London. So well, there are great research institutes outside of London and doing some interesting things, but it's clear the centre of gravity is the Golden Triangle, and actually London is the dominant player in that ecosystem. Well, and I think you do look at other clusters around the world, and there is a lot of value in doubling down where you have the most productivity, and so I think it's not surprising that you do see this very disproportionate return profile in the Golden Triangle, like you do in Silicon Valley, like you do in Boston. It's just the nature of talent and synergies and interactions, ability to be close to your customer base, ability to kind of attract global talent, which I think is something that we think we should probably think about more, is just to continue that kind of drive to bringing the really, really, really the best talent into the UK and London. And there's opportunities, I think, that are coming about because of geopolitical issues, and that mean that there may be more or less appetite depending on for people to move here.
Yeah, we've certainly seen in our deep tech portfolio recently actually some interest from some sort of global investment players who I think are trying to diversify a bit away from the US scene, partly because of geopolitical issues, and that's to our benefit. So hopefully we can exploit that across all of our companies.
Yeah, I agree. I do think, and I think fundamentally that also then leads to kind of the appetite of the people that come here, right? And I think it's true whether it's deep tech or it's software or it's consumer or any other business, the biggest factor that differentiates success from failure is still a founder and the appetite of that founder.
Yep.
And so creating a space to bring people that have the appetite to go and really disrupt the world, that are competitive enough to like go and want to go head to head with the very best is, I think, going to be the difference in the long run between, London and Europe always playing second fiddle and really actually developing an ecosystem and a set of companies that are global in scale and kind of, as Reid Hoffman said recently, moving away from being a referee between the US and China and actually playing the game.
Yeah.
And I think that's like quite a good analogy. But you need the right people that have the hunger to go and do that.
Yeah, and actually, I think we're in a good place, particularly from so one of the strengths of Silicon Valley has been the sort of recycling of talent, people coming back around and taking their experience and having another go. And we're starting to see that, like we had some big exits in deep tech in the last couple of years. So GraphCode, SoftBank, and FeatureSpace and others, Darktrace, and we're certainly seeing the impact of those entrepreneurs and the people involved in the core functions of those companies sort of coming out and helping and starting new things. We have Nigel Toon, who built GraphCore, is helping with our memory company and on the board there and adding huge value. And I start to see that flywheel happening more and more in our deep tech businesses across the UK.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think actually there's always been, and maybe you know this firsthand because you're old, but
Thank you.
But there's been this kind of discussion around the kind of cultural differences between US, Europe, UK, and I think historically there probably was, right, in some ways, in a kind of appetite to go and scale, but that, as you say, is a precedent thing, right? You can only do what you see and you can believe, and so. But I think more recently, actually, the appetite and the hunger from founders is increasingly there and is on par, and our talent base is there. And I think, as you're showing with the data around bigger checks backing those people, I think it's just for the UK and Europe to really, from a kind of investor base at this point, and from an enterprise base, to go and support them to really go after that.
I mean, to an extent, I think we have this idea that there's this cultural issue, and our founders are less ambitious, well, partly they're adapted to the environment that they're in, and you can actually, I don't think our founders or people from the UK or Europe are naturally less ambitious than founders from the US. I think they've been constrained by the capital environment for a long time. Yeah. And if you're setting out and you can only raise 2 or 3 million in the first instance because that's the size of the funds you've got interested in your technology, then you have to cut your cloth and you have to go as fast as you can according to the capital. So if you're sitting in Stanford and you're surrounded by VCs willing to write you a $20 million check in the first round, and laying out a journey in front of you that's massively ambitious, then naturally you can follow that path. If you're sitting in a small university in Europe and the local funds can probably scrape together $1 million for you, that is going to be the guardrails on your ambition. Yeah. So I kind of reject the idea that it's just because we're less ambitious. I think it's a problem of the capital markets, and the data from Bohus shows that the capital markets are changing.
I mean, I agree. I think it does become a feedback cycle in the sense that often it's people that were in that kind of ecosystem from the founder side that become investors. If that's the kind of environment they know, then they project it themselves, and so you get into this self-fulfilling prophecy of some ways where you are limiting the capital. But if we can, and I think we are seeing it, really start to back them, as you say, I mean, it's very easy to dream big when you have the funds to go after it properly.
I've seen it firsthand, not very relatively recently. Entrepreneurs who we've helped, create their businesses from the university level, like they haven't yet got the kind of vision of the ambition that they might have if they were starting from a US university or starting from a US capital base. But if we work with them and introduce them to capital sources that can allow them to build at level, at scale and at pace, like their ambition and the way they think about the world changes instantly, which kind of is a clear proof point to me that it's nothing to do with their internal inability to have that ambition. They are cutting their cloth to the environment they're in.
Yeah.
So the more, and that's something that we do a lot, right? We are introducing a lot of our founders to ambitious big funds, and helping our founders connect with and build into those dreams and those visions, and create journeys for themselves, which create unicorns and big companies.
Yeah, I think a lot of the role in, especially when you're working with really talented PhDs and technical engineers coming out of either industry or university at an idea stage, is you're never going to tell them how to build their technology better, but you can give them the belief in themselves to believe that they can go and achieve something really massive, and to not constrain what they think they can do based on what they have at their disposal today. And I think that's probably the biggest value that you can provide at that earliest stage, is just genuine belief and connections and relationships. I think there's also one of the areas that is probably still worth thinking about, and as you say, why we connect them in often with big funds coming out of the US and get them connected and well integrated into the US market, is how fragmented Europe is in terms of particularly at growth, right? And this kind of the industrial base of Europe and the UK is slightly older enterprises that don't necessarily give them those big contracts to go and scale. So thinking maybe if there is an area that's probably still worth thinking about, I think to be if you're taking like a European perspective, is probably at that level. Like, how do you actually enable these companies to get the sizable contracts to drive their real growth?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that partly comes around to bringing talent who know how to do that. Bringing people in who've either worked for the hyperscalers already and have figured out how to build go-to-market in those areas, or have built companies that have solved that problem in that space. Mm-hmm. So I think this comes back to the recycling of talent, which is that flywheel is now far better than any time I've ever seen it. It's 10 years of now investing in London from my perspective, and it's chalk and cheese in terms of the level of advice and talent and people you can bring in to support entrepreneurs as they grow.
I do think people forget that Europe and the UK are very young in this game comparatively. I think it's still just the beginning in many ways versus the US. And so I think there's a lot of learning still to do, but I think the progress has been really quick. And I think actually, if you take a positive look at some of the kind of issues and difficulties in the world, often breeds innovation, right? It forces you to kind of go and scale faster, and to rethink how you can get more for less. And I think we have more of a culture of abundance. So if we can get more for more quickly, I think Europe will be quite quickly in a better position.
I mean, politics and the news recently has made it quite clear that Europe has to become more self-sufficient and more able to stand on its feet. And that's going to involve like having bigger ambition and more capital deployed into our own companies to grow them. The one area that's like obviously massive in that space is defense tech. Like Europe is going to need to be completely differently like specced out in terms of its military and its defense capabilities than it has thought it's going to be for the last 20, 30 years, or at least it's relied on the US. So it's a big opportunity, and it's an opportunity for us to back our own innovation, our own talent and tech. Yeah,
I agree. And I think it is at a time where what it means to have a solid defense network and to stand on your own 2 feet isn't what it meant say 10, 15 years ago, where it was you necessarily have to expand your army by 10x to and have this massive standing army. I think technology across domains, from electronic warfare to autonomy, means that is that kind of dynamic has changed, and it provides an opportunity for Europe to use their technological advantages to really scale and to stand on their own 2 feet without the support, without necessarily needing a population growth of 10x.
I mean, Ukraine has shown that in spades. They've taken commercial or drones that are available to to the public to buy and turn them into change the face of warfare with them because they needed to in a very short space of time. To their credit, they've managed to use that very effectively.
Yeah, I think it is one of the interesting parts about how AI interacts, and I guess you could call it embodied AI, but how I think as compared to say the knowledge economy, AI is still relatively more nascent in the kind of real physical world. It's developing really quickly, but robotics still a bit behind. But I think as AI develops, you think about how humans have built technology for the real world, from kind of manufacturing factories, automation lines. They were always built to constrain the environment, so you get repeatable processes. As AI develops and it becomes more generalizable, and it allows you to utilize actually less advanced hardware in some ways because it can compensate. And I think that provides a real advantage from a kind of European perspective. But it also means and necessitates that we rethink how we manufacture and how we scale. And I think some of the more interesting opportunities are actually around that. Like, how do you think about building, say, robotics and manufacturing them in Europe and in the West? And, I think right now there's an opportunity to do a lot more quickly with lower cost, like a lower cost of goods, basically from a kind of manufacturing perspective. And I think there will be a big company that's probably built in that area at some point.
Yeah, for sure. What do you think about sort of the UK's kind of AI sovereignty and like what we as a nation should do as a sort of outsider? And an insider at the same time. Like,
yeah, I'm an outsider when it suits me, and an insider when it suits me.
Exactly. What do you think about like our AI sovereignty? What does it mean for the UK, and what should the UK be thinking about with respect to AI and its future place in the world?
I feel like you've only asked me this because you can get your plug in that you went to number 10. And so I'm going to get ahead of you and say that to ruin that for you.
Okay, well done. But perfectly ruined.
I think that's an interesting question. I think that the commoditization of intelligence and foundational models in the sense that, we've seen with DeepSeek and other open source models that we can have really powerful models for actually comparatively cheap, is a net positive for the UK. I don't necessarily think that you need to be building those foundational models per se here. Definitely not like on the kind of OpenAI Anthropic scale. I think it would be difficult to frankly catch up, and the kind of that game of infrastructure costs and compute costs is one that suits America. But I think that the application of that is where you get sovereignty, right? How do you actually build systems on top of these foundational models? How do you fine tune them and build on top of them, but particularly the open source ones, to enable and use and produce uniquely British, European products and services that are culturally aligned, that serve our interests?
Are we truly sovereign if we're building on top of an OpenAI model?
But what does true sovereignty mean? Like, I guess, like,
do we have control, or are we basically still subject to having to go cap in hand to the Americans and say we need to borrow your models to build on, please?
Well, I think DeepSeek and the open source models allow us a base for us to improve, and I don't think we necessarily need to be doing that training per se here. I guess a loose analogy is, every advanced economy essentially is taking goods from other economies and then enriching, refining to sell them on. To me, when I say that foundational models and the commoditization of intelligence is a benefit, it feels to me that that's a similar idea, where we're taking this kind of unrefined, at times, base commodity, and we're enriching it, and we're creating value add on top. And as much as maybe some people think otherwise, I think the world is an interconnected economy, and you can't. It's very difficult to get away with that.
I'm now imagining a world where there are tariffs on using OpenAI. Which,
I mean, the one counter to this is, like, I guess, and it's not impossible. You just get super intelligent AGI, and then the foundational models themselves are all you need. In that world, it's very difficult to postulate anything, to be honest. that changes everything. So I tend to, as it stands, I think this is that you get enough sovereignty by being able to play off the different models against each other, by having open source, by having your own servers and compute locally for mission critical or national security, obviously, areas.
So would you invest more in like local compute than you would in like building the UK foundational model?
I think, so 2 years ago I would have said no for sure. Like, I think the US and European kind of relationship was strong enough that I really don't care where the data center sits that you train it, once you can use it. I think maybe increasingly there's value to be had in being able to build the kind of data centers and compute that allows you to drive and maintain sovereignty in core areas in the UK and Europe. So potentially, yes. I think DeepSeek has shown that you can build models for a lot cheaper. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there. What I would definitely not do is kind of go down the approach of trying to go head to head and compete with the Anthropics and the OpenAIs at this stage for kind of a scale-based approach to development.
Yeah, understood. What other topics were we supposed to talk about? Just looking to Katya here, who's tells us what to do in the background.
Do you want to talk about quantum at all?
Quantum has had a lovely few months.
How are we going to segue that?
Quantum has a lovely few months. I don't know, some clever editing, or they'll just do this whole bit, and it'll be obvious that we're not very good at this bit. Quantum. There's been a few interesting news stories. Obviously, Willow came out last year, and then we had Microsoft with their topological qubits, which everyone got very excited about. And it was kind of exciting in some respects. Although I remember when I first invested in Phasecraft, I think first investment was 2018, or at least I was writing the papers in 2018. And I referenced Microsoft's efforts to build topological qubits back then, and it seemed like a very big challenge. And they now appear to have maybe got one, which is excellent, but it's still one, and it maybe works. Even in their own paper, there's sort of a reference to it not being absolutely clear that it is what they think it is.
I just laughed, and all I could think of is the quantum physicists rightfully sneering at me as they're like, as I make fun of that achievement. But
the science seems very impressive behind what Microsoft have done, but ultimately. There's an awful lot of work to do to scale that out. It sort of says to me that news was like there is a possibility that topological groups could be now considered a potential interesting avenue to explore, but it's no more than that. It's got a hell of a long way to go before it can be considered kind of alongside the current paradigms which are kind of leading. But it's all I think interesting. All of these results, like the Willow result, the Microsoft, are all just sort of other bits of the puzzle falling into place. Yes, this thing is going to work. Like these kind of what seemed like almost mind-bending theories are now showing themselves more and more to be able to be substantiated in physical form and actually do calculations and error correction and all the things you need. So I think you're seeing an increase. One of the interesting things was watching the share price of all the quantum computing companies as these announcements are made, and they all have a huge tick up. Whether they're that related to what Google are doing or not, everyone in the quantum sphere gets a tick up, and I think that's generally just sentiment that. The more and more we see these positive signals coming that bits and pieces are working, and fidelities are getting better, and error correction is more scalable than we thought, and all these kind of things. I think it just increases confidence that we will get there on quantum.
Yeah, as everyone can probably tell, Dave's more of the quantum guy, and I'm a bit more of the AI guy. I'm going to ask a loaded question.
Okay.
Like, do you think that quantum hardware will develop fast enough that we get meaningful value out of quantum before, say, AI develops models capable of approximating to a good enough level a lot of the same solutions, such that the kind of value increase that quantum gives shrinks?
I think for certain problem sets, where certain types of optimization, certain simulation environments, certain kind of materials and physical form where quantum is important, like the actual quantum interactions at the fundamental level are important. I think AI will help us get some interesting answers that are close to the target, but quantum will allow us to be absolutely like bang on with very small computational times, very quick processes. So I think the idea of quantum computation being kind of fully fault tolerant and universal, and it replacing all of kind of conventional compute is unlikely. But quantum computing solving problems that otherwise AI is either running for many years and getting close to. I think quantum has a place to be just much more accurate in those spaces, and we've seen. Even the stuff that spacecraft are doing on these like really, really limited chips, they're able to give you better answers than state-of-the-art computational techniques even now. So they're doing things with quantum chips that outperform currently, and those chips are getting better and better. So I think there'll certainly be places where that value is created.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably true. I do think it's an interesting dynamic, the kind of timelines for quantum hardware versus the kind of rate of progress in AI. But as you say, I think in particularly in specific areas where maybe there's not a big enough training set, or there's our models essentially require those same kind of physical computational approaches or experiments to develop the data set, and that slows them down. We're probably, I think that's the areas that I would say quantum still has a significant advantage.
Yeah. And I think ultimately it won't be, do you use quantum to solve this problem or do you use AI? It'll be AI gets you close, quantum sort of like then sort of refines that answer, and maybe then you loop back around again and do it, and we get to like perfect, brilliant answers. And so we've got, superconducting materials that are just, absolutely brilliant at room temperature, and we've got photovoltaic cells that are 10 times as efficient as they are now. Yeah,
I was chatting with one of the engineers at Phasecraft about that kind of idea of looping together what Phasecraft's been able to do on the kind of quantum side with what to enable them to produce data that you otherwise wouldn't have to then train a model, and can you get into this lovely loop of AI and quantum goodness. So
yeah, I think that's the way to view it. It's not to view it as a kind of arms race between the two technologies, but they will eventually converge, and you'll see massive value created out of that conversion. So I think it's what I was really excited about.
This is completely unrelated to anything Kathy has put into this script, but it's very important. And I don't know if anyone's ever getting this far in our podcast, because I don't. So
well done if you've got this far.
But I would like everyone to get Dave to get on board the space tech bandwagon. So if anyone wants to give some arguments or make fun of him for being a space tech hater.
So the background to this is that we're trying to focus down on the areas that we invest in deep tech, because the explosion of deep tech has been great. It just means there's lots of deep tech out there, and we're trying to kind of pick the areas that we're best suited to invest in and where we think the returns are better. In general, I've found space tech to be an area that I struggle to see like the venture returns, I see the risk as very high, like because until recently, like there's been much harder to get stuff into space. Like although those costs are coming down, it's still you've sort of got almost nation state level risk trying to deploy like satellites or other bits and pieces. So I haven't yet seen an investment that's really compelling on that front, but.
SpaceX not doing it for you.
As soon as you find that amazing investment and show it to me, Seb, I'm all over it.
Fair enough. I just like the idea of having really massive data centers floating around in space. I feel like that.
I mean, they've solved the cooling problem.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're or drop them really deep in the ocean or something. I think I'm still a little bit. I do kind of lean toward. I sympathize with some of the things that Dave says on the space tech side. That's why I'm crowdsourcing for strong, compelling arguments, because I like the idea of space tech.
I'm looking forward to you presenting your first exciting 10x winner on space tech.
I'll keep thinking about it.
You were at Visionaries. You went to the Visionaries conference in Paris. How was that?
Yeah, it was really good. In general, I don't even think this is a controversial take. I think conferences and panels and different things are usually not that valuable. But this one, I think the Visionaries Club did an amazing job at it. So not that they're listening to this, but shout out to them. The speaking, they had Dario from Anthropic, Demis. As you can see, I'm using their first names because we're friends like that. Buddies. Yeah. They had CEO of Grok, CEO of OpenAI. I think, and a really good room. I thought it was somewhat interesting that they were talking about super intelligent, godlike AI in a cathedral in Paris. I don't know if that was on purpose, but I appreciated the kind of the play there. But yeah, that I think we need more of that, getting the right, like all of these names in the room together. Eric Schmidt was there talking about the kind of his and Reid Hoffman around, how we can kind of build the European ecosystem. And it was actually them that also made this comment around, they don't see it as a kind of lack of founder ambition anymore. It's a willingness to deploy capital from our side as investors to really, really embody what the power law game that we play and to go after these kind of 1,000x return companies.
I think I think James Regan from Oriel was at the Visionaries thing as well, and I think he's a great example. Like, that company's been backed with proper capital, and he is they are shooting for the stars. A huge ambition, building a network which will transform compute, and he's British and he's built companies in Europe before, and actually I think he would probably say his previous companies have been constrained. The ambition of his previous companies have been constrained by capital. This time, we've hooked him into the sources of capital. He's growing. He's raised proper money. He got people excited to put more money into that company, and that company is growing as fast as any other company in the space. I don't think it could grow any faster, even if it was based on the West Coast. And it's a perfect example of this. And we see other founders like I think of Walter over at Fractile. He doesn't lack ambition. He's got capital, proper capital behind him. He's growing. So these companies are out there. We just need to, we as investors, hold the key, like deploy the capital, get them moving, encourage them, link them into the bigger sources of capital so they can grow quickly. I think
the other person that you could shout out from the kind of that comment around how do you encourage real talent to get here as well and to build here is Carbon Re. I think it shows the value of having and being able to lure people over to this side of the woods.
So Josh joined Carbon Re start of last year, had already built and sold businesses before, came to the UK because he was excited about the ecosystem here and is just knocking it out of the park with that company. So we've got, and again, making sure that he's got the right capital to scale is going to be ensuring that he matches his own ambition.
Dave is a value-add investor. His focus is very much on creating rhymes for Carbon Re.
That's true. That's the one thing I do help Carbon Re with, is creating their kind of next rhyme. I think their first rhyme was 5 in 2025. No, it was right. I can't remember what it was. 5 live by December or something, and now they've got a new rhyme. Anyway, that's my main. You
can tell he's really good at it.
Yeah, really good. Thank you for shouting out for all my talent. Cool. We'll probably wrap up there.
Oh yes,
I think you look happy
we should get an outro at some point.
Oh, what would an outro look like?
You play music. You can do a jingle.
Oh, okay. I'll bring guitar next time.
Yeah. Also, you can not include this, but I'm really I like the name Alinea, and I would like us to name our podcast Alinea rather than Deeptech Mash. Vote for the name. All one of our votes will be really appreciative. And tune in next time.
Tune in next time when we'll be discussing something even more exciting than this week.
Yeah.